Many of us, walking through the ruins of old European castles or looking at photographs of Spanish missions in the American Southwest, have asked ourselves the same question. How is it that walls built hundreds of years ago without cement or modern technology stand as solid as rocks? At the same time, brick buildings erected during the gold rush or even modern concrete structures begin to crack and crumble after only a couple of decades. We are accustomed to thinking that progress makes things better, stronger, and more durable. But the history of frontier architecture cruelly mocks this belief. The secret of the ancient masters, whether they were builders in medieval Europe or monks erecting missions in the deserts of Arizona, lies not in magic or lost super technologies. Their approach to construction was fundamentally different, based on a deep understanding of the nature of stone and the laws of physics and chemistry, which we have safely forgotten today in our pursuit of speed. They did not try to defeat nature with rigidity and force, but learned to cooperate with it, allowing their buildings to breathe and move with the earth. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, but was almost lost during the Industrial Revolution and the mass settlement of the Wild West. Watch the video to the end to learn how living mortar saved walls from earthquakes, why modern engineers are ashamed to study the ruins of forts, and what simple ingredient made masonry virtually eternal. What if I told you that the main reason our houses are falling apart isn't because of the materials, but because of our minds? Two completely different philosophies of construction collided in the Wild West, and we can see the results of that collision with our own eyes today. The Spanish colonists and early settlers who came to these lands in the 18th century built with eternity in mind, erecting walls that would outlive their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Their goal was to create a safe haven in a harsh and hostile world, a fortress capable of withstanding the siege of time. They did not count the hours and days spent selecting the perfect stone or preparing the right mortar, because time was their ally, not their enemy. Each stage of construction was a ritual that required patience and meticulousness, whether it was burning lime or drying adobe bricks under the scorching sun. For them, a building was a living organism that grew slowly but surely took root in the ground. This philosophy required enormous labor, but it paid off handsomely when the rainy seasons came or raids occurred. In contrast, the era of American expansion in the 19th century brought with it a philosophy of temporary dwellers obsessed with quick profits and instant results. Boom towns that sprang up around gold mines and railway stations were built with one goal in mind: to start making a profit as quickly as possible. Buildings were erected in a matter of weeks, often without foundations, from raw timber or poorly fired bricks held together with hastily mixed clay. No one thought about what would happen to this saloon or bank in 50 years because everyone hoped to get rich and leave in a year. This rush dictated its own rules. Instead of carefully fitting stones together, thick layers of cheap mortar were used to hide the mason's mistakes. Craftsmanship gave way to speed, and unique knowledge about the properties of local materials was discarded in favor of standardized but unsuitable solutions. We see the consequences of this haste in ghost towns. Collapsed walls, gaping window holes, and piles of bricks turned to dust. Where the Spanish mission has stood for 300 years, the American bank from the Gold Rush era has fallen into ruin in half a century. The paradox is that 19th century builders had better tools and more advanced logistics, but their creations lost the battle against time. They relied on the power of steam engines and industrial goods, forgetting that durability requires respect for the material. Stone does not tolerate haste, and any attempt to cheat physics in order to save time turns into a disaster in the long run. Early craftsmen understood that a wall must be heavy and massive, not only for protection, but also for the stability of the structure itself. They spared no effort in creating thick walls that acted as thermoregulators, keeping cool during the day and warm at night. Modern builders on the frontier tried to save on wall thickness, relying on new, strong cements, which in fact turned out to be too rigid. This saving of materials meant that buildings could not withstand the temperature fluctuations of the desert. The fast and cheap philosophy became the curse of Wild West architecture, leaving us with picturesque but sad ruins. We look at these ruined cities and see not only the traces of time, but also a monument to human greed and short-sightedness. At the same time, the old stone forts and missions stand as silent reproaches to our haste, demonstrating the superiority of patience over vanity. The difference in approaches also applied to the choice of construction sites. The old master spent years studying the soil and wind currents. The settlers of the new wave often built cities in the beds of dry rivers or on unstable slopes, just to be closer to the gold. Nature punished such neglect severely, washing away entire settlements with the first heavy flood. Ultimately, the history of frontier architecture teaches us that the true strength of a building lies not in its foundation, but in the builder's intention. If you build to sell and leave, your house will collapse as soon as you turn your back on it. If you build to live in and leave a legacy, the stones will hold up the sky for centuries. Why do you think we have practically lost the ability to build for the ages in the modern world, despite all our technology? Write your opinion in the comments. We are very interested to hear your point of view, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other historical paradoxes. Are you ready to learn the truth about breathing stones? The durability of ancient walls was based on a material that is now undeservedly forgotten or misused. We are talking about simple lime, which in the hands of an experienced craftsman was transformed into a unique living adhesive. Unlike modern Portland cement, which hardens into a dead and rigid monolith, lime mortar retained its amazing properties for centuries. It did not simply bind the stones together, it interacted with them, creating a flexible and adaptive structure. The process of creating such a mortar began with the burning of limestone in special kilns, which can be found on the outskirts of many old settlements on the frontier. The stone was heated to white heat, removing carbon dioxide from it and turning it into quicklime, a chemically active and dangerous substance. This was followed by a slaking process when the lime was mixed with water and left to mature in pits for many months and sometimes years. The longer the lime was aged, the softer and more plastic the future mortar became, acquiring an oily structure. The secret was that the lime mortar never hardened completely and irreversibly like modern concrete. It entered into a slow chemical reaction with carbon dioxide from the air, gradually returning to its original state of solid limestone. This process, called carbonation, could last for hundreds of years, and during this time, the wall continued to gain strength. It turned out that the building literally petrified over time, growing into a single monolith created by nature itself. But the most amazing property of lime mortar is its ability to heal itself, which seems fantastic to us today. When micro cracks appeared in the masonry under the influence of wind or foundation settlement, moisture penetrated them. The water dissolved the free lime inside the wall and carried it to the crack, where it reacted with the air again and crystallized. The crack grew over by itself, filling with fresh stone, and the wall restored its integrity without human intervention. Modern cement, which appeared on the frontier in the second half of the 19th century, had completely opposite properties. It was incredibly hard and durable, much stronger than the brick or sandstone used to build houses. This would seem to be a good thing, but in the conditions of extreme temperature fluctuations in the Wild West, this hardness became fatal. When the wall heated up or cooled down, the hard cement prevented the soft brick from expanding, and the brick simply broke into pieces. Lime mortar, on the other hand, was softer than stone and acted as a cushion between the blocks. When the temperature changed or the ground shifted, it crumpled, allowing the wall to breathe and move without collapsing. It was a sacrificial layer that took on all the stress, keeping the main building material intact. This is why we often see old walls with weathered joints but intact stones, and 19th century walls with intact joints but cracked bricks. The craftsmen of the past understood this principle perfectly. Mortar must always be weaker than the stone it binds. Violating this golden rule in favor of faster cement setting led to what we call rigidity disease in architecture. Old buildings were able to adapt to changing conditions. They lived in harmony with their environment. New buildings, on the other hand, tried to resist the environment with their rigidity and inevitably lost this war, becoming covered with a network of irreparable cracks. In addition, lime mortar had high vapor permeability, allowing moisture to escape freely from the wall. In houses made of modern concrete or hard cement, moisture is often trapped inside the walls, causing rot and destruction when it freezes. Old walls worked like a wick, drawing moisture from the basements and evaporating it through the joints, keeping the house dry and healthy. This knowledge of materials chemistry was intuitive, but incredibly accurate, developed over thousands of years of trial and error. By losing it, we gained speed in construction, but lost the durability and reliability that our ancestors were so proud of. But why then were the walls made so uneven and thick if the mortar was so good? We will discuss this secret of geometry further on. I discovered this by accident while studying a cross-section of an old fort wall. At first glance, the walls of old fortifications or missions seem to be just a pile of stones stacked on top of each other and held together with mortar. But if you look inside into the cross-section of the ruined masonry, you will see a complex and ingenious engineering system. We are used to building walls as a homogeneous mass, but ancient craftsmen used a technology that could be called the sandwich of eternity. The outer layers of the wall were laid out of carefully fitted, hewn stones, creating a beautiful and durable facade. However, the most interesting thing happened inside the wall, in the space between the two outer layers of stone cladding. This void was filled with what is known as rubble, a mixture of broken stone, gravel, brick fragments, and a large amount of lime mortar. This inner part was not just rubbish. It acted as a flexible core that distributed the load. When a shell hit the wall or the ground shook from an earthquake, the outer stones could shift, but the viscous core dampened the energy of the impact. This design made the wall not a rigid beam, but rather a bag of tightly packed gravel that was impossible to break because it did not resist but absorb force. While in a modern brick wall, a crack usually goes all the way through, tearing the structure apart, in such layered masonry, the crack died out, getting stuck in the soft middle. This allowed walls 1 meter thick or more to stand for centuries, even if the outer stones fell out or weathered away. The geometry of the walls themselves was also strikingly different from our modern, familiar boxes with right angles. If you look at old buildings in the Southwest, you will notice that the walls often taper upward, forming a trapezoidal profile. This was not the whim of an architect or the mistake of a clumsy mason. It was a precise calculation based on gravity. The wide base provided a low center of gravity and incredible stability, pressing the building to the ground. The sloping walls, or buttresses, directed the load vector inward, causing the stones to press even more tightly against each other under their own weight. Gravity, which usually destroys buildings, worked here to strengthen them, constantly compacting the masonry. The heavier the wall, the stronger it became, unlike modern skyscrapers, where weight is an engineer's worst enemy. In addition, the builders avoided long, straight lines, which modern designers love so much, because a straight wall is unstable. They often use curves, angles, and projections that acted as stiffeners, increasing the spatial stability of the building. Take a look at the plans of old forts. They are always complex geometric shapes, stars or polygons that support themselves. The internal structure of the wall also involved the use of long punch stones that passed through the entire thickness of the masonry, connecting the layers together. These stones acted as reinforcement or anchors, preventing the outer facing from separating from the inner core. The absence of such connecting elements in 19th century masonry often led to beautiful brick facades simply falling off the main building in whole layers. Attention was also paid to the stones themselves. They were never laid haphazardly, but rather each one was placed in the only correct position. The master had to lay the stone so that it would lie stably, even without mortar, resting on its neighbors with its entire surface, rather than at points. The mortar only filled the voids but did not bear the main load, whereas today we often see bricks literally floating in a thick layer of cement. This system required a huge amount of material and labor, but it created structures capable of surviving any disaster. We have forgotten how to build this way because we don't want to waste space on meter-thick walls and time on their construction. Like this, if you are also impressed by how physics worked for ancient builders without computers or calculations. What I am about to show you is forbidden in modern architecture textbooks. Choosing stone for construction in the Wild West was not a matter of aesthetics, but a matter of survival and knowledge of geology. The old masters never brought materials from far away unless it was absolutely necessary. They worked with what was under their feet, and there was a profound reason for this. Stone born in this area had already been tested by the local climate for millions of years. It was adapted to these temperature fluctuations and to the chemical composition of rain and groundwater. The settlers, however, often made the fatal mistake of trying to bring in materials they were familiar with from other regions, or making bricks from unsuitable local clay. Red-fired bricks, which stood up well in foggy London or on the East Coast, began to crumble into dust in desert conditions. Salts in the soil of the Southwest penetrated the pores of imported bricks and literally tore them apart from the inside when they crystallized. Local builders, who adopted the techniques of the Pueblo Indians, used sandstone and limestone, which had a layered structure. They knew that the stone had to be placed in the wall in exactly the same position as it lay in the rock, with the bed facing down. If a layered stone is placed vertically, water will get between the layers, freeze, and split it like a book. This simple rule of the natural bed was often ignored by hurried masons in boom towns, which led to the detachment of facades. Particular attention was paid to so-called wild stone, unprocessed boulders collected from riverbeds. These stones, worn smooth by water, were incredibly hard, but their rounded shape made them difficult to lay. The craftsmen used a complex technique of polygonal masonry, selecting stones so that they fit together like a puzzle, leaving virtually no gaps. This required phenomenal visual acuity, but created a wall that was resistant to any vibrations. In regions where stone was scarce, they used caliche soil, a mixture of clay, sand, and lime, hard as concrete, which lies beneath the desert soil. Blocks carved from caliche were as strong as factory-made bricks, but were completely inert to the aggressive local environment. Buildings made of caliche have stood for centuries, becoming only stronger under the scorching sun, while wooden frame houses rot or burn down. The use of local materials meant that the building was fully compatible with the landscape, not only visually but also physically. The thermal expansion coefficients of the foundation, walls, and soil were the same, so the building and the ground breathed in unison. When concrete and steel were brought to the desert, a conflict between materials became inevitable. They expanded differently, tearing each other apart. But even the best stone is useless if the foundation is not built correctly. In the next chapter, you will learn why our houses are sinking into the ground. Modern builders cannot imagine starting construction without an excavation pit, reinforcement bars, and concrete mixers pouring a powerful slab or strip. We think that the deeper and more massive the concrete in the ground, the more reliable the house will be. However, looking at the old buildings of the frontier, we are surprised to find that many of them have no foundation in our understanding. Nevertheless, they do not sink into the mud or crack, putting our engineering standards to shame. The secret was that ancient craftsmen did not fight the soil, but used its properties to create so-called floating foundations. They dug a trench that was significantly wider than the future wall and filled it with large cobblestones or crushed stone without binding them with mortar. This cushion acted as drainage, instantly removing water from the base of the wall and preventing it from washing away the building. In addition, this dry foundation acted as a giant hinge or shock absorber between the building and the ground. When the ground froze and swelled, causing the earth to rise and fall, the stones in the trench simply shifted slightly relative to each other. A rigid concrete strip would have burst in such conditions, transferring the rupture to the wall of the house, while the stone cushion dampened the deformation. The building literally floated on the waves of the ground, remaining intact. The builders were well aware of the danger of capillary moisture absorption from the ground into the walls, which destroys the masonry from the inside. Therefore, the first rows of masonry above the ground, the base, were always made of the densest and most waterproof types of stone, such as granite. This created a natural barrier to water, a kind of waterproofing, without the use of roofing felt or bitumen, which would have rotted away in 50 years. In the boom towns of the late 19th century, foundations were often made of cheap brick or porous sandstone laid directly in the mud. Builders hoped that the weight of the building would press the foundation into the solid layer, but instead the bricks absorbed water and crumbled within a couple of winters. The result was warped doorways and cracks large enough to stick your hand through, a typical sight in abandoned towns of the Wild West. Interestingly, old craftsmen laid huge monolithic boulders, cornerstones, under particularly heavy corners of buildings or towers. These stones distributed the point load over a huge area of soil, acting like snowshoes. A technique was also used to widen the base of the wall, with the lower rows of masonry protruding outward in steps. This not only increased the support area, but also protected the soil at the base from being washed away by rainwater flowing off the roof. The water fell further away from the wall, keeping the foundation dry. A simple but ingenious solution. Today we rely too much on chemicals and concrete in an attempt to seal the basement completely. The old builders knew that water would find its way in anyway, so their task was not to stop the water, but to let it go. Their foundations were permeable. They breathed with the earth without creating areas of increased water pressure. This art of working with soil required patience. Trenches were often left open for a season so that the rains could compact the bottom. Surprisingly, many of the principles of these primitive foundations are making a comeback in green construction today. We are rediscovering what was obvious to any mason 300 years ago. You have to negotiate with nature, not fight it. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of rain? Water is the main enemy of any building, and the battle against it was fought not only underground, but also on the surface of the walls. In medieval Europe and colonial American architecture, there was a system of wall protection that we have now almost lost. This was the sacrificial layer, lime plaster and whitewash that covered the masonry, protecting it from direct contact with rain and wind. We are used to seeing old buildings with beautiful exposed stonework, and it seems to us that this has always been the case. In fact, during their heyday, these buildings were plastered and whitewashed, shining white in the sun. Exposed stone is most often the result of centuries of neglect, when the protective layer has crumbled away, exposing the skeleton of the building. Craftsmen knew that stone, no matter how strong it was, would eventually be destroyed by erosion, so they covered it with a coat. Lime whitewash was not just paint for beauty, it was a complex antiseptic and protective compound. Lime killed fungus and mold, preventing them from taking root in the pores of the stone. But most importantly, it filled small cracks and pores, creating a smooth surface from which water rolled off without having time to soak in. This layer was sacrificial because it took the brunt of the elements and slowly deteriorated, saving the main wall. It was easy and inexpensive to renew. Once a year or two, the owner simply took a bucket of lime and whitewashed the wall again. It was a simple maintenance procedure that extended the life of the building for centuries, much like we change the oil in a car. In the era of the gold rush and rapid construction of the frontier, this culture of building maintenance was lost. Brick and stone facades were left exposed for fashion or to save time, and hard cement was used as mortar. Water penetrated the bricks, froze, and the facade began to flake, literally losing pieces of the building's face. In addition, old craftsmen used protruding cornices and roof overhangs not only as decoration. These were engineering elements that threw rainwater far away from the walls. In boomtown architecture, roofs were often made flat or with minimal overhangs, and water flowed directly down the walls, washing away the mortar. Drip moldings, special grooves or projections on windowsills and cornices, played a special role. They caused water droplets to fall down without reaching the wall. The absence of this small detail in cheap construction led to wet streaks forming under each window, which turned into ice wedges in winter. Lime plaster had another amazing property. It acted as a membrane. It did not allow water to penetrate in liquid form, but allowed water vapor to escape. The wall always remained dry, while modern paints and sealants often trap moisture inside, turning the wall into a thermos with mold. We have forgotten that a building requires constant care and minor repairs. We want to build something once and forget about it for 50 years. But the laws of physics do not work that way. Failure to regularly whitewash and renew joints is one of the main reasons why our cities are deteriorating so quickly. Returning to the understanding that a building should have a replaceable skin could save billions in capital repairs. But in a world of disposable items, the concept of eternal care seems archaic. How do you feel about the idea of annual maintenance of your home's facade? Are you willing to spend time on it for the sake of longevity? The Wild West brought with it not only new people, but also a new destructive force that old walls had never encountered before. It was the vibration from railroads, heavy steam engines, mining crushers, and explosions in mines. The frontier land was constantly shaking, and this became a real test of strength for all types of buildings. Rigid brick buildings on cement mortar were the worst affected by this vibration. The rigidity of the structure, which seemed to be an advantage, became a fatal flaw in conditions of constant shaking. The vibration was transmitted from the foundation to the roof without attenuation, causing resonance. The bricks loosened, the rigid mortar cracked, and the connections between the building elements were destroyed. Many solid buildings near the railways turned into emergency barracks in just a couple of years. Walls built using old techniques with soft lime mortar behave completely differently. Thanks to their plasticity and viscosity, they dampen the vibration, absorbing its energy in a multitude of micro-movements within the joints. The wall functioned as a huge, massive shock absorber, where each stone was slightly movable relative to the other, but the entire structure remained stable. Adobe buildings, typical of the Southwest, were particularly good at withstanding vibration. Adobe is a sun-dried brick made of clay, straw, and manure. This material has unique viscosity and elasticity. Adobe walls do not crack from shaking. They play it back like thick rubber. The straw inside the brick acts as reinforcement, preventing the clay from crumbling. In cities where huge stamp mills were used to crush ore, the noise and shaking were constant. Miners noticed that the expensive brick hotels built by investors from the East quickly became covered with a web of cracks. At the same time, modest Mexican houses made of adobe or rough stone on clay stood as if nothing had happened, despite their outward unattractiveness. This observation led to an interesting hybrid style in some mining towns. Clever builders began to make the first floors or plinths out of solid stone on lime mortar to dampen the vibration from the ground. The upper floors were built of light wood, which also withstands shaking well thanks to the flexibility of the joints. The old sandwich technology with a cavity inside the wall, which we discussed earlier, also played a key role here. The loose core of the wall dissipated sound and vibration waves, preventing them from destroying the load-bearing outer layers. It was natural sound insulation and vibration protection built into the structure itself. Interestingly, modern earthquake-resistant technologies largely replicate these principles, using rubber gaskets and movable joints. Ancient craftsmen did not know the theory of waves, but they felt that rigid structures would always break faster than flexible ones. The pursuit of monolithism and rigidity in the 19th century was a mistake that cost many buildings their lives. Once again, we see that the ability to adapt and yield to force is sometimes more important than the ability to resist it directly. The stones did not fight the train, they simply allowed it to pass by, swaying slightly in their limestone bed. In the Wild West, the climate was no less a harsh enemy than bandits or lack of water. The scorching heat of the desert during the day gave way to the piercing cold at night. For any building, such temperature swings are a tremendous stress, causing materials to constantly contract and expand. Here, the thick stone walls of the medieval type gave the pioneers' thin plank huts 100 points ahead. Massive stone or adobe walls had enormous thermal inertia. They functioned as natural energy accumulators. During the day, when the sun heated the air to 40 degrees Celsius, the thick walls slowly heated up, absorbing heat but not allowing it to enter the house. The room remained refreshingly cool as if in a cave. At night, when the temperature in the desert dropped sharply, sometimes to freezing, the heat accumulated during the day began to slowly radiate into the house. The wall worked like a huge oven, warming the inhabitants without any fire until morning. By dawn, the wall cooled down, ready to take on the heat of the sun again. This cycle repeated itself endlessly, creating a comfortable microclimate inside. American settlers who came from the humid and wooded East did not understand this principle at first. They built the frame houses they were accustomed to, made of thin boards, which turned into real ovens in the desert during the day and froze in an hour at night. Living in such houses was torture, requiring enormous amounts of firewood in winter and making it impossible to stay inside in summer. In an attempt to solve the problem, they began to clad their wooden houses with brick, but often did so incorrectly, leaving no air gap. The difference in temperature between the wood and the brick led to condensation, rotting of the frame, and destruction of the cladding. Thick masonry also provided protection from the wind, which could blow for weeks on the plains, blowing heat out of any crack. Mortar and plaster made the wall windproof, while the dried-out boards of frame houses whistled in the wind, letting in dust and cold.
Lower it down slowly.
The high ceilings in old missions and forts were also no accident. Hot air rose and collected under the roof, where ventilation windows were often installed. Below in the living area, the air remained cooler. Pioneers, on the other hand, built low ceilings to save materials, condemning themselves to stuffiness. Thus, architecture was not just a matter of durability, but also a matter of survival in an extreme climate. Old walls were an active part of the life support system, a complex engineering device powered by solar energy. Modern air conditioners have allowed us to forget these principles and build glass skyscrapers in the desert. But if the electricity is turned off, these buildings will become uninhabitable in a couple of hours, while the old mission will remain a cool refuge. In the next chapter, we will talk about why the most beautiful buildings often turned out to be the most short-lived. At the end of the 19th century, Victorian architecture, with its intricate decor, tall windows, and whimsical turrets, became fashionable on the frontier. Wealthy mine owners and cattle ranchers wanted to show off their status by building palaces in the middle of the prairie. But this pursuit of external beauty and complexity often ran counter to the principles of durability and common sense. The complex geometry of the roofs, numerous internal corners, dormer windows, and extensions created dozens of potential places for leaks. The more complex the roof, the greater the chance that snow would accumulate somewhere. Water would find a crack, and the wind would tear off a poorly secured element. Older buildings had simple gabled or flat roofs, from which water drained quickly and easily. The huge windows that were fashionable in the Victorian era were a weak point in the wall construction. They broke up the monolithic masonry, creating areas of stress concentration. Each window needed a lintel, which was often made of wood or metal. These materials expanded differently than stone and inevitably caused cracks in the corners of the openings. Decorative elements made of plaster or soft stone that adorned the facades quickly deteriorated under the impact of sand and wind. They required constant repair, which the heirs of the first owners often could not afford. The building began to lose its luster and then its structural integrity, as the destruction of the decor opened the way for water to penetrate the walls. In addition, the bonding of the joints in the masonry was often compromised for the sake of beauty. The facing bricks were laid in even columns without displacement, which made the wall extremely unstable. Such cladding was held only by metal ties, which rusted and burst, causing entire facades to collapse onto the sidewalk. In the pursuit of height, thin walls were built that were unable to withstand wind loads without additional supports. These buildings were held together by internal partitions and floors, and as soon as the wooden floors burned down in a fire, the outer walls collapsed like a house of cards. Old forts and missions were honest buildings. Their beauty stemmed from their function and reliability. They did not try to appear to be anything other than what they were. Victorian mansions and ghost towns, on the other hand, are decorations that could not withstand the collision with reality. Complexity is the enemy of reliability. This engineering law was forgotten in favor of vanity, and the desert punished it severely, wiping hundreds of pompous buildings off the face of the earth, leaving only the modest but sturdy walls of the early settlers. We often confuse beauty with quality, and the history of the frontier is an excellent reminder that true style is practicality. As we walk through historic sites and admire the durability of old walls, we often fall into a logical trap known as the survivor bias. We see the San Jose Mission or Fort Laramie and think, that's how they used to build. All buildings were like that. But the truth is that we are only seeing the exceptions, the lucky ones that won the lottery of time.
It's a testament, ain't it?
For every stone building that has survived, there are thousands of huts, dugouts, wooden shacks, and poorly constructed brick houses that have disappeared without a trace. The Wild West was filled with temporary, substandard housing that fell apart in the rain, burned down from a spark from a locomotive, or was simply abandoned by its owners. We do not see these ruins because nature has already digested them. The buildings that have survived are the architectural elite of that time. They were built by the wealthiest communities, the church or the state, employing the best craftsmen and using the most expensive materials. Comparing them to the mass construction of the 19th century or modern prefabricated houses is not entirely fair. It's like comparing a 1920 Rolls-Royce to a modern budget sedan and saying that cars used to be better. However, even with this in mind, the lessons of the old masters remain relevant. The few buildings that have survived have done so precisely because of the principles we have discussed. The flexibility of the mortar, the massiveness of the walls, the right choice of location and materials. They have undergone natural selection, proving that physics cannot be cheated. The ruins we see are not just stones. They are a textbook of mistakes and achievements. The cracked wall of a bank in the ghost town of Bodie teaches us that you cannot build on hard cement in an earthquake zone. The preserved arch in the Tumacacori mission teaches us the power of geometry and lime. History does not preserve the average. It preserves either the great or the accidental. But by studying these preserved fragments of the past, we can understand how to build our future so that it does not turn to dust in 100 years. We must stop looking at construction as the production of square meters and start looking at it as the creation of a living environment in harmony with the laws of nature. In the end, perhaps the secret is not in how they built, but in why we have stopped appreciating it. We have traveled a long way from lime molecules to the geometry of fortress walls to understand a simple but bitter fact. The secret of medieval durability, which was also used in the Wild West, is not a lost technology, but a lost attitude. An attitude towards time, labor, and responsibility to the future. Our ancestors built slowly because there was no need to rush. Eternity lay ahead. We build quickly because we are afraid of not having enough time. They used soft materials so that the building would live. We use hard materials so that it stands still and it breaks. The stones are the same, the lime is the same, only we have changed. If you enjoyed this analysis of the architectural secrets of the past and want to learn more about the technologies and everyday life of the pioneers, write in the comments. What should we talk about in the next video? Maybe how water was obtained in the desert or how the first railways were built? Your ideas are our inspiration, and of course, subscribe to the channel so that history comes to life on your screens.